recording this session because I know we've got a few folks who registered who can't make it but want to see the recording. Let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to, this is actually our first virtual presentation featuring a guest. We're super excited to have Bonnie Clark here today. My name is Shayla Miles. I'm the Program and Development Manager at the Pacific Bonsai Museum, and I'm one of your hosts for today. And just a reminder that these Q&As are a benefit of your museum membership. So thank you for being a member and for supporting the museum. So today's presentation we're really excited about. It's called Finding Solace in the Soil, the Archaeology of Gardens and Gardeners at Colorado's Japanese American Internment Camp. Again, with Dr. Bonnie Clark of the University of Denver. I'm going to introduce our curator, Erin Packard, here momentarily to situate Bonnie's work within the context of our World War bonsai exhibit as well. But before I hand it over to Erin, I wanted to go over just some quick housekeeping notes. So again, we are recording this session. To submit a question, please use the Q&A function. You'll see that in Zoom. It shows up at the bottom of my screen in Zoom. Don't use the chat. We will address questions after Bonnie's presentation, but feel free to submit a question anytime throughout the presentation, but we'll do Q&A at the end. And then for the chat, if you have any technical questions or issues with the webinar, you can send those through the chat, and then I will be also including some links in the chat for further references on some of the presentation topics and a few other tidbits. So you can look at the chat as well. And then our plan is to spend about 30 or so minutes, potentially more, to hearing from Bonnie, and then take questions after that. And we'll wrap up around 1 p.m. So here we go. I'll turn it over to Erin Packard, PBM's curator.
Thanks so much, Shayla. Thanks everybody for joining us today. I'm really excited to introduce our speaker, Dr. Bonnie Clark. Dr. Clark is committed to using tangible history, objects, sites, and landscapes to broaden our understanding of our diverse past. She began her career as a professional archaeologist and now serves as the professor in the anthropology department at the University of Denver. She is also the curator of the, as well as the curator of archaeology at the Denver University's Museum of Anthropology. She is the author and/or editor of numerous publications, including Finding Solace in the Soil, in Archaeology of Gardens and Gardeners at Amache, and On the Edge of Purgatory, in Archaeology of Place in Hispanic Colorado. Dr. Clark leads the Denver University's Amache Project, a community collaboration committed to researching, preserving, and interpreting the physical history of Amache, Colorado's World War II era Japanese American incarceration camp. That work has been highlighted in numerous venues, including Archaeology and American Archaeology magazines. And in 2011, Dr. Clark's work was recognized by her peers with the University of Denver's Teacher Scholar of the Year Award. And I first became aware of Dr. Clark listening to a podcast by History Colorado, which looked at the early Denver Bonsai Club and the their evolution post-World War II, which led to ties to the Amache incarceration camp, which featured Dr. Clark's work. And I reached out to her and we started a conversation about the museum borrowing some objects that she had found through her excavations that tied to gardening practices at the camp. And so we have an alcove here in the museum's World War Bonsai exhibit all about Amache, because Amache was really significant for its connection to the wartime bonsai practice, as most of the really well-known bonsai practitioners pre-World War II found themselves at Amache, specifically the Demotos that we know so well through their representation in our collection, as well as other individuals. So with that, I wanted to turn it over to Dr. Clark.
Well, thank you so much, Erin. I really appreciate the opportunity to share more about my work here. Speaking of sharing, I'm going to get the shared screen going. And also thank you to Shayla from somehow at the end of this, instead of at the beginning. I'm going to stop share. Sorry about that. You'd think I'd get used to this. I do it all day when I'm teaching my classes, but there we go. Okay, wonderful. So yeah, thank you to Erin and Shayla for making the arrangements for this talk. So I want to start out today with some words that people really rarely associate with sites of incarceration: beauty, hope, community. And yet in the 6 summers of archaeology that I have led at Amache, where Japanese Americans were confined during World War II, my crews and I have found incontrovertible evidence that those ideals were consistently materialized through gardening. The backstory to these gardens is one of the sad ironies of American history. The late 19th and early 20th century was characterized by both a fascination with Japanese design, especially as it was expressed in gardens, and a simultaneous mistrust of Japanese people. It became a symbol, status symbol for non-Asians to have Japanese-style gardens or to employ a Japanese gardener. And yet many of these same people likely supported restrictive legislation like California and later Washington's alien land law, which prevented Asian immigrants who were classified by federal law as aliens ineligible for citizenship from owning land in those states. The law was primarily aimed at Japanese farmers who since the 1880s had been emigrating to the West Coast. Some of these first generation or Issei came from farming families in Japan with skills in the high yield farming of the Pacific Rim. But they were joined by others, often pushed into agriculture by anti-Asian unionism and other professional restrictions. By 1940, 43% of West Coast Japanese were employed in agriculture and another 26% in agricultural related businesses like produce stands or nurseries. This is a population who had literally put down their roots in American soil. But Pearl Harbor would change all of that. In the wake of the attack of the Japanese military on Hawaii in December 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which allowed the US government to exclude anyone, including citizens, from any area of the US if it was deemed a military necessity. Quickly thereafter, the West Coast was made into an exclusion zone for people of Japanese ancestry. The official justification of this act was to prevent them from aiding the Japanese military during World War II, and yet this was actually against the advice of naval intelligence, who had spent a lot of time in the Pacific and who noted that Japanese immigrants who had chosen to make their homes in the US and their citizen children were exceptionally loyal to America. And in fact, not a single Japanese American was found to have committed an act of domestic terrorism during World War II. And those who joined the army, pictured here at Amache, were in the most decorated unit of the war. Instead, as a congressional inquiry in the 1980s concluded, based on a study of all the government documents from the era, the real cause of Japanese American internment was, quote, racism, wartime hysteria, and a failure of political leadership, unquote. Once an exclusion order was posted, the evacuees had just 1 week to put their affairs in order. They were allowed to bring only what they could carry, and the decision of what to bring and what to leave behind was very difficult. Oral histories suggest that among those precious belongings were seeds, a practice we have found hints of archaeologically, and also seedlings and sometimes bonsai. After being forced from their homes, Japanese Americans were first housed in makeshift accommodations. These detention, or as they were called during the war, assembly centers, sprung up nearly overnight in locations up and down the West Coast that, like the fairgrounds, were never meant to house people. Despite the fact that these centers were to be inhabited for only a few months, many imprisoned there embarked almost immediately on gardening, planting with no guarantee of harvest. After several months at an assembly center, incarcerees were taken via train during the summer of 1942 to one of 10 quickly built confinement camps in the interior of the US. This map shows the exclusion zone along the Pacific Rim of the US, including the western half of Washington, the location of the Pacific Bonsai Museum. The Japanese American population of the exclusion zone was about 120,000 people, 2/3 of whom were born in the US and thus citizens. This map also shows the location of the 10 primary incarceration sites to which the population was sent. These were managed by a civilian agency, the War Relocation Authority, or WRA. I've highlighted Minidoka, where residents of the Seattle and Tacoma areas were sent, as well as the WRA camp in Colorado, where I do my research. The official name of that camp was Grenada, named after the small town adjacent to the camp, but it quickly came to be known as its postal designation, Amache. Over 10,000 people would spend at least part of World War II at Amache. The first incarcerees came largely from the Central Valley of California, including the residents of 3 Japanese farming settlements. They were joined by residents of the Northern California coast, many of whom had made their living via poultry raising or seasonally harvesting crops. Thousands also came from the Seinen, a neighborhood in Los Angeles home to professionals such as landscapers, truck farms, produce stands, and also backyard nurseries. Amache is located in the Arkansas River Valley of Colorado. The central camp area was a square mile enclosed by barbed wire and guarded by armed military. Like all 10 of the camps, it was designed to be self-sufficient so as not to tax a system already experiencing food shortages. So the entire project area, which is what you see on this map, included 10 square miles, mostly pre-existing agricultural facilities that included irrigated fields and a working dairy and cattle ranch. These were typically worked by incarcerees who were paid a very minimal salary, typically $16 or less a month. The central camp area itself is located on a sandy terrace above the valley floor. It's minimally productive land that since the 1980s has primarily been used for grazing cattle. Native vegetation that grow in the sandy soil are hardy plants like the yucca featured in this graphic made at camp. And in fact, every one of the trees that you see in this overview photograph does not belong here. It was planted by an internee. The people at Amache made their way the best they could, often engaging in pastimes that reflected the transcultural nature of Japanese American communities, with thousands attending both baseball games and Obon, the annual Buddhist festival marked by community dances. Many of these formerly busy individuals had too much time on their hands, something that the WRA recognized. It supported the efforts of incarcerees to teach and practice the arts, which flourished at Amache and all 10 of the camps. In his book, Beauty Behind Barbed Wire, published in the 1950s, art historian Alan Eaton wrote that at Amache, one traditional art that was particularly popular was bonkei, or the making of miniaturized landscapes. He recounted a story told to him by Kusen Nunomiya, who had been trained in this art form before camp. She and her 2 boys arrived at Amache during a sandstorm, which is a story that I hear a lot. But she decided to turn that menace into art by using sand in her landscapes. She soon was teaching others, and by 1943, she and nearly 100 pupils put together an art show that was attended by thousands of people, including visitors from outside of the camp. Eaton, in his book, described it as, quote, the most extensive display of bonkei in the Western world, unquote. Conclusive evidence that bonsai was one of the traditional arts practiced at Amache remains frustratingly out of reach. Unlike bonkei, no articles about bonsai were published in the camp newspaper, but photographs like this one, taken in of one of the Amache's barracks blocks, suggests that it likely happened. Pierced cans like this were often found in garden settings and are an example of Amacheans imaginatively using the meager resources of camp to beautify their settings. That sand of the camp and the semi-arid and windy environment, which had tormented Amacheans like Kusen Nunomiya, ironically has served to protect the historic camp landscape after it was closed in the fall of 1945 at the end of the war. After closing, the buildings were dismantled, but the land was not developed, and the sandy native soil blew in and protected the camp landscape. And so here you can see some of the plants that were the trees and plants planted by Amache incarcerees that still grow on the site. And those landscaping materials, as well as the concrete that you see here, are the foundations of the barracks, as well as individual items that were sort of lost and discarded during camp. All of them together mean that Amache has a great physical integrity as an archaeological site. And because of that integrity and its historical significance, it was designated a National Historic Landmark in 2006. I became interested in the possibility of doing research at Amache around that time. But before ever going in the field, I reached out to camp survivors, to their families, and to the town of Grenada, which is the owners of the camp. I wanted to make sure that archaeology would be a welcome intervention and would be built on the knowledge that both of those communities have about their past. Those consultations not only yielded stories of life during World War II, but also significant historic documents that families had kept of their time at Amache or living in Grenada during the war. Through those interactions, we also connected to Amache survivors and descendants who were eager to work with the college student crews doing research on the site. So those community archives and our conversations with participants have greatly enriched the research. After several years of consultations, we held our first archaeology field school at the site and the associated museum in Grenada in 2008. That was the first of 6 summers learning about Amache through community engaged landscape archaeology. One of our most time-intensive but revealing work has been systematically surveying the site to identify and document the remains of gardens and other landscaping features. So we basically walk back and forth, almost touching hands, looking for all of these changes that may have been and marking them out and documenting them. And by doing so, we are able to capture all this information of where things happened and what remains. And from the outset of the project, and I did a lot of work looking through historic documents like this one, it was clear that there had been a transformation of the camp. And I was really interested in how Amacheans were taking that expertise in growing things that so many of them had, as well as values and aesthetics, and applying them to this entirely new environment of the high plains of Colorado. I was also interested in what landscaping and the garden features reveal about connections and strategies inside and outside of the camp in a situation of upheaval and shortage. We have discovered many ways that Amaches didn't just change, they radically transformed this stark camp landscape. They basically turned a prison into a town. Our survey results reveal just how common, but also how variable the landscape and gardens of Amache are. The site has many entries, examples of the 3 types of gardens that are often found at WRA camps. So these are entryway gardens that flank the doorways of barracks. And if I get my pointer out here, I think, there we go. I've got a laser pointer. So these are these entryway gardens because these are where the doorways were of the barracks. And then we also have public area gardens in like these 2 here, and then gardens that flank mess halls. And then we often find other gardens that are on the edge of these blocks that are sometimes more like a community garden, vegetable gardens. So I'm trying to get rid of that laser pointer there. Excavations, which we do in a few chosen gardens, reveal really important details about these gardens, about how they were constructed, the activities that happened in them, and what was grown in them. Information that we recover through systematic soil sampling for seeds, for pollen, and for other botanical remains. That was how we discovered that this garden employed transplanted native plants, which is something that we find in many of the Amache gardens. The design of this garden is very symmetrical, which is something that's not usually associated with Japanese gardens, but is perhaps reflective of the work experience of the nearly dozen LA area professional gardeners who lived in this block. And it's a good reminder that these are, as garden historian Kendall Brown has noted in his work, Japanese American gardens. Excavation revealed that the walls of this garden bed were made of cinder blocks that had been carefully split into 4 pieces. So a few whole examples remain around the site, but as used in this garden, they're very deliberately cut and shaped. And as modified, they look like a fairly passable mock basalt, which is a much more typical material for a Japanese garden. And this is one of the many good examples of the ingenuity of Amache's garden designers and how they transformed institutional materials in these spaces. Other excavated gardens have employed much more traditional Japanese garden design, although also using improvised materials. In this case, the concrete byproducts of camp construction are used in the place of large stones. These were surrounded by a layer of gravel from the Arkansas River, that one 3 miles north of the camp. And this garden yielded few plant remains, either through seeds or pollen. And so it was most likely a kara sansui, or a dry garden of the kind found in some Zen Buddhist temples. In addition to documenting garden design, one way that we've assessed horticultural expertise exhibited in the Amache gardens is through testing the soil chemistry of gardens against off-site and non-garden area controls. The chemical analyses indicate that in almost every garden strata, there are more useful nutrients for growing of plants, and often a more balanced pH than in the surrounding soil. Some amendments we have encountered include marine shell, eggshell, fish remains, and even iron slag from the blacksmith shop. Despite the short duration of the occupation and the quickly draining sandy soil, there remains 75 years later a legacy of care for the soil in a place that no one chose to live. Geological sourcing has allowed us to identify that many garden stones were transplanted to Amache, not just from the Arkansas River, but as far away as the foothills of the Rockies. These are a tangible reminder that the camp was far more porous than most imagine, with people leaving temporarily on work permits or for group activities like Boy Scout campouts. This top stone is actually an example of petrified wood, and the nearest outcropping of a stone like this is actually at a place where we know the Boy Scouts went to camp. So I wonder, but that someone didn't pick this up and bring it back for Grandpa's garden. So on these forays away from camp, like the Boy Scouts, striking natural stones were a prized find that were brought back to beautify camp. The results of pollen analysis have been truly surprising. Like I wait like Christmas morning for my results to come back from my palynologist. We find evidence of all kinds of plants that really have no business growing on the high plains, like dogwood, cattail, and this one, canna, which is a tropical plant that is a relative of ginger. Our first evidence of canna came not from an entryway or ornamental garden, but from a vegetable garden. It grew alongside potatoes and is evidence that victory gardens at Amache held a mixture of culinary and ornamental plants. Most of these gardens were not made by experts in Japanese garden design, but they are shaped by traditional philosophy, such as motonai, the idea that reuse is a virtue and waste is a shame. These images capture how in one garden, broken pipe was transformed into a planter, the one on the bottom, and in another above, broken tile used as decorative paving. A few of the Amache gardens were made by experts, like the Domoto family that Aaron spoke about, and the gentleman who designed this entryway garden. Before the war, one of them had worked as a gardener for the LA Railway, while the other had owned a cactus nursery. This feature is a great example of the way that Japanese garden design can be translated in even the most inhospitable settings. This appears to be an innovative example of a centuries-old Japanese gardening technique of ikidori, or capturing alive. So I get my pointer up here. Maybe you could see this if you have any knowledge of a prickly pear, that's what that is. And so this concrete was actually poured on top of a prickly pear and created that imprint. And by utilizing this concrete piece with a prickly pear cactus impression, what the designer does is evoke a cactus without having to walk past it daily in an entryway garden. And I really love the idea of this millennial old technique being accommodated through the often unlovely material of concrete. And I think it has even more resonance when we know that at least one of the gardeners who made this space was an expert in growing cactus. I consider one of my primary tasks as an archaeologist to notice patterns in the material traces of humans' behavior and then to try to explain them. And over the course of 6 seasons of archaeological research at Amache, one of the most robust and somewhat mysterious patterns is the ubiquity of gardens. In every single block occupied by the Japanese Americans confined at Amache, we have uncovered gardens of different size, composition, and complexity. There are many answers to the question of why there are so many gardens at Amache. And some of them are quotidian. You know, vegetables from Victory Gardens add variety to a somewhat dismal mess hall diet. Gardens keep the grit down in a region that's only just coming out of the Dust Bowl. Evaporation from ponds like this one would have created more equitable microclimates. And fast growing plants like morning glories, which we've uncovered in some gardens, would have hid shabby institutional architecture. But the energy poured into these gardens suggests that something deeper is at play. And my study of Japanese garden history and of horticultural therapy has convinced me that gardening was ideally suited to help the people of Japanese ancestry imprisoned at Amache cope with a nearly unlivable situation. They were in a world where the social ground was constantly shifting. One day they were high school students or optometrists, and the next they were prisoners with no idea of when or if they might be released. Those who were immigrants were people literally without a country, while their children were citizens of a country that had turned its back on them. But they had a set of skills honed over generations for bringing harmony to at least one little part of their world, their gardens. In 2012, we excavated what turned out to be a stunning Japanese-style entryway garden. One of the reasons that I chose to further investigate this garden is its primary feature, this wall that evokes stone, but is in fact made of concrete slabs. And not only is the wall a skillful evocation of a mountain range, it's also sited in a really interesting manner. The designers created mindfulness by placing the wall right in front of the barrack door. So when we removed the blown in sand between the wall and the barrack door, we discovered this beautiful cedar walkway that led directly from the doorway to the wall. And from there were stepping stones that went either way. And so each time the residents who were served by this doorway transitioned between the world outside and their barrack, they would have had to slow down to be aware and present for at least a moment. And that kind of mindfulness is often one of the goals of traditional Japanese garden design. And yet to grapple with the Amache gardens, or really any garden, we need to think not just about the art, but about the act. The physicality of creating and maintaining a garden is yet another of its virtues. The daily chores of watering or weeding and seasonal efforts like picking up fallen leaves or harvesting vegetables are acts that keep a garden in harmony, but they also keep the people doing them in harmony. Physiological studies have shown time and time again that engaging with plants reduces heart rate and cortisol levels. In that way, science and Japanese garden philosophy, as expressed by this quote from the first designer of a Zen garden temple, converge in really interesting ways. In taking care of their gardens, Amacheans took care not only of themselves, they took care of each other. When faced with uncertainty, They put their hope in each other and in nature. The picture that comes from the gardens of Amache is that of resourceful, imaginative, and skilled people. They turned an oppressive and monotonous environment into one that was beautiful and useful. And despite being singled out for their ancestry, they did not abandon it, but expressed it insistently and creatively. And so they have left for us a legacy of dignity, an insistence on their own humanity, despite outside forces bent on denying it. And that is a legacy, I think, from which we can all learn. We are also living in uncertain times, those in which a healthy mind, body, and soul connection are needed more than ever. So to encourage that connection, I want to leave you today with a recipe for an Amache-inspired garden. It's based on the hundreds of gardens we've surveyed and the dozen or so that we've excavated. So here's what you need. You need something whose value is overlooked. So it could be something bound for the trash, or maybe a corner of your yard that is otherwise wasted space. You should choose something that's tied to your heritage. Maybe it's a kind of plant that was grown by a grandparent, or an item that is related to an ancestral place. And finally, something that is native to the place where you live. A plant or a stone will do. So here is my Amache-inspired container garden. In it, I reclaimed a broken pot and a piece of concrete that was cast off from a construction site around the corner that I walked by every day as at the beginning of COVID with my dog. And I noticed that it was, although smaller, very similar in shape to some of the pieces that were in Amache gardens. The plant is my native, and it is a wine cup or poppy mallow, and its family is Malvaceae. And that's one of the plant families that we've recovered through pollen analysis from the Amache gardens. And then in this planter, I've paired it with a domesticated variety of purslane, which is one of the wild plants that we've found transplanted in several of the Amache gardens. And for my heritage piece, I have two things. I have a stone that I collected from the shores of a lake where my family and I love to go fishing in my home state of Utah. And also joining it is a stone that a student gathered for me from the banks of the Arkansas River. And so if you would like to try your hand at a Amache-inspired garden, the museum wants to hear from you. So if you get inspired to make your own garden, there's the email address for you to send your picture, and you put Amache garden in the subject line. And I believe that the link was also just put in the chat. So what I've shared today with you is just a taste that's explored in more detail in my recently published book. And while I'm doing all of these book presentations, my press has kindly offered, if you order the book through their website and use that discount code, you can get a 40% off on the book. So even though it's an academic book and those tend to be a little more expensive because it's in hard copy, it's pretty reasonable with that discount. But much more important than plugging my book, I'd also like to appeal to you to help preserve the gardens of Amache for the future. So the site is a National Historic Landmark, but it's still owned by the small town of Grenada and managed basically by its high school principal and his students who volunteer. But just last week, a bill was introduced in the US legislature to make Amache part of the national park system. And this is a bill that is overwhelmingly supported by the town of Grenada and Amache survivors and their descendants. Currently, 3 of the 10 WRI sites are part of the park system, including Minidoka, but all of them are in the far west. And as you can see from the reminder from this map is that Amache is on the Great Plains, and it helps connect the Asian American Pacific Islander history to the American heartland in a really, I think, important way right now. And the 2 sites that you see here that are in Arkansas that are further a little east, neither of them have that high physical integrity that Amache has. Amache is, along with Manzanar, probably the ones that have the most intact of that historic cultural landscape. And I hope you've also sort of been convinced today that as the archaeology has shown, that there's still so much to be learned from this site and from the people who unwillingly called it home. And so I've shared an advocacy link that's just gone up in the chat, some information about the Historic Sites Act, but also an advocacy link that would make it easy for you to reach out to your congressional delegation. And if you believe that Amache would be an important addition to our national storehouse of heritage, I hope you will speak up for its preservation. And right now is a really critical time. It's just been introduced and it still has yet to come before for a vote on the floor. I tell my students that it takes a village to do archaeology. And so I want to end today by acknowledging those who have supported this work in many ways. And also to provide for you links. And again, these will also go in the chat. This garden research is part of a much bigger project. So for example, there's been over a dozen master's students who've completed research either at the Amache site or at the Amache Museum. And so if you're intrigued and would like to know more about that work, you can please visit our project website, or you can follow us on Facebook if that's something that you do. We put updates about our work and about this related history. And we do plan to return to the site in the summer of 2022, and we'd welcome you to come and join us. And if you follow the Facebook page, you'll get updates about that. With that, I would love to open up for questions that people might have or conversation. I thought I'd leave up the PowerPoint for a while, at least, because if sometimes I know people ask questions that it's helpful for me to flip back and I can show you another image. So.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Clark. Thank you so much. Yeah, so please, again, just you can submit your questions in the Q&A section in Zoom. We do have one question that I'd love to start off with. I'm wondering if you could, Dr. Clark, talk a little bit about what those conversations were like with the Amache community members that you said kind of started the whole process that you had before you partook in any archaeology.
So yeah, one of the things is that we just really wanted to say, to find out, would this be okay? We're looking at basically people's trash. And I think that's a kind of a moderately invasive act. And so we wanted to, talk to them about what their research priorities might be and to make sure that folks felt welcome. And so I kind of knew we were on the right track. I went and was doing some background research at the wonderful Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles. And while I was there to look at some of the records that they had about Amache, I actually met a gentleman who is a retired professional photographer and also had been a young boy at Amache. And he asked me, could I come with you in the field and could I bring my grandson? And I said, well, of course, absolutely. And so that started this tradition that we have now that every season that we've been in the field, we've had at least one camp survivor with us, and we've always had a descendant as well. And I think that in terms of those conversations, some of the most important ones have been about the intergenerational impact of this, and also about family experiences, what it was like, what stories were told, what stories weren't told. And so that we could kind of fit that in with some of the things that we were seeing. And we heard a lot from people just about how desolate the landscape was for these folks coming from a much greener area, and they're out here, and this is basically the desert. And, it's a sagebrush plain. And that was really disorienting and disheartening to people. And so that immediately turning around to try to, plant things and have some greenery was such a priority, and people just like that landscape being a sort of oppressive was really impressed on us.
Awesome. And then a quick follow-up just on a similar topic. Does your book include any personal narratives by Amache incarcerees or their family members?
Yes, it does. So we've got, I've been able to do a number of oral histories. So we've got a lot of information from oral histories. We draw on some, I draw on some published accounts that people wrote about their time in camp, and also things like letters. And then we also just have lots and lots, and you've seen a few here, but of these beautiful pictures that people had in their family scrapbooks of life in camp, and especially of the landscape and the gardens. So it's there's probably 80 pictures in the book.
Wow. We've got a question from Christine. Thanks, Christine. Have any other incarceration sites been studied in the way that you have studied Amache?
Well, there's been probably the one that's had the most active archaeological research is Manzanar, which was also the one that first became a park. So they have a wonderful community archaeology program there that is in some ways similar to ours, and they have done quite a bit of work and the gardens there. And most of those are really to kind of, they have really these, they had really well-known landscape architects and garden designers at Manzanar. And so they've got some really stupendous, lots of big hardscaping and rocks that are much larger than the folks at Amache had access to. So they've been kind of clearing those out and making those more visible to people through excavation. Kind of what makes our work different is partly that ours is very research oriented. So the fact that for all of these, I can't tell you how my students get so sick of taking soil samples. So, we're sampling for the soil chemistry, we're sampling for pollen, we're sampling for these things that are called phytoliths that are, they're actually little silica bodies that often give plants their structure. And like pollen, they last for a long time, as well as, things like seeds and plant pieces. So like sorting through all of that, it's really time intensive, but that's how we've been able to really reconstruct the plants that were there, and also to just understand the crazy investment in really amending the soil, which is, so to me striking about both just like, this is the way you do things, and also just how skilled they were in knowing how to take this really pretty unproductive soil and do things like grow canna and other like tropical plants in it. So the fact that we kind of return every other year, and that we have this ongoing project that also works in the museum, so that I do think that makes us unique. But certainly it's not the only site where archaeology is happening and where research on the gardens is happening. There's a really great project right now by a PhD student in Stanford who is a descendant from Gila River, which is one of the camps in Arizona. And he's doing a lot of really wonderful work of like us doing kind of surveys to really understand the extent and the variety of the gardens at that camp. Some of the other camps, again, there's not much of them left in terms of being able to find the gardens. So like the two ones in Arkansas are basically under soybean fields. So that's one of the reasons that I feel very strongly about, preserving the Amache sites, because it kind of helps us understand and envision what likely happened at these other camps too, in places where the physical record is not as accessible to us.
Can I ask a question, Dr. Clark? What percentage of the site have you excavated?
Oh, excavated? Oh, it is certainly under 1%.
Wow. Okay.
I mean, so excavation is really time and resource intensive. Mm-hmm. We've excavated like a dozen gardens. And, I'll flip back to that because I didn't. This is a good example. Each one of those squares is 2 meters by 2 meters. So, and we've got 3 of them put together, but there's a lot more to that garden that we didn't excavate. And that's partly because I feel like, some of the things that I do, especially like the soil chemistry analyses and our ability to be able to even understand that there is this thing called a phytolith and that we can recover them. I dig this in a way that people didn't dig even 20 years ago. And so my feeling is that in another 20 years or another 100 years, people are going to be able to find out lots more from these. And so we never fully excavate a garden. We only excavate a portion of it and we leave the rest of it as a sort of our gift for the future. Now, with regards to the survey, we've completed about 3/4 of the portion of the camp that the internees lived in. And that's been really our focus because my thought is that while we have folks to talk to, and this is the part of the camp that they're really invested in, that we should complete that work. And sometimes we're actually able to work with people who either themselves or their families lived in the block that we're researching, which makes it all, just really hit home for folks. So we're, our hope is that as we return, that we are going to finish at the very least, doing that intensive survey for all of the barracks blocks. We are not going to dig every Amache garden by any stretch of the imagination, and that's as it should be.
You mentioned the Bonke, society, so to speak, at Amache that that Eaton referenced. Have you found anything that would connect to that that art form, like any smaller containers or shallow, pots that might have been used for anything like that? I imagine they probably could have taken them with them since they were smaller and might have been something, that wasn't left behind. But I'm just curious if there's been any of those artifacts found.
Well, I will have to say that it seems like a lot of the artwork people took with them, or they might have given away. And that's how Eaton ended up with so many, because people gave them to him because he expressed interest in these different art forms. I know that the Bonke were largely, and we can go to that picture. They were largely in trays that were created from shipping containers.
From wood, yeah.
So this is, just scrap wood. And in this case, it's lacquered. So we do find a lot of wood, and some of it was clearly once part of something else. But, wood decays pretty quickly when it's exposed to the elements. And even though it's a pretty arid place. We don't have, I've never seen anything that I could say that I know that's what it was. We certainly do have these. We have lots, and that's, I believe you guys have one of those in your exhibit, right? So we have these pierced tin cans, and some of them so carefully, like every hole is, they know exactly, it wasn't like somebody just slashed at it. So we have, and sometimes people ask me, what's the definitive Amache artifact? And I'm like, it is a modified tin can. And so sometimes it's going to be a plant pot like this. Sometimes it's going to be a homemade bucket. We find lots of homemade buckets. So they're going to put wire through the top of one of those big mess hall tin cans. We find them carefully pierced and in such a way that they have been turned into food graters. We think they're being used to steam things. So like when because they're supposed to not be cooking in their barracks, but they obviously are. And everybody has a potbelly stove, so you can use those as like basically a steamer. So we think that they're using that.
Wow. Yeah, it's interesting too. The other question I had, and I don't know, Shayla, if there's anyone else, I don't want to monopolize the Q&A, but the last question for me, at least, unless anyone else has any other ones, is you referenced the where the people were living, where in California they came from. You said Los Angeles, and they sort of created this more symmetrical Western style garden, with maybe their exposure to gardening as a profession. I'm just curious if you've done any more research to link the occupants of the barracks to the gardens that were outside those barracks, to see if there were any higher concentration of gardeners, or any sort of regional observations or things like that you can speak to as well. That was really fascinating.
Yeah, so in my book, we're able to, the War Relocation Authority kept really extensive records. And so this is a great example. I'm glad I've got this up. So here, this says Block 9E, Building 6. And then each one of these barracks had a different designation. And so I know exactly whose barrack this is.
Do you know off the top of your head?
I don't, not off the top of my head,
Okay.
but I can look it up. So
yeah,
so
I'd be interested to know.
The records exist for who lives where. And so in the instance, so that's why I was able, when I talked about the garden where it was designed by these professional gardeners, one of whom had a cactus nursery. So what I did is that I looked at their names. Actually, it was a student of mine who did some research on them and went back to the documents that the War Relocation Authority had that said what their pre-war occupations were and what their names were. And so then I looked them up in the, and did some research in census records to find out sort of like what was written down about their professions in these various different years. And so, and in my book, I talk about how in some blocks we have a lot more, for example, professional people from who were nurserymen, who had nurseries before the war. And in some instances, like maybe everybody is farmers. And I think we do see differences, but it doesn't seem like it's not so consistent that I could predict, if that makes sense. Like I can't say, okay, if it's a block with lots of gardeners, then it's gonna have this kind of landscape.
Yeah, but likely that there were more gardeners next to gardens, right? Than ones. I noticed in that map you had done of the aerial showing the different types of gardens. There were some barracks that didn't have any gardens, right? So there was some the outliers, I guess, in that regard.
There are definitely some outliers, but I think also in those instances, it just may be that we can't see it anymore.
Okay. Interesting.
Because if you look at these overview shots, and I think I've got one right here. I mean, look at that.
Oh yeah, that was striking when you said all those trees are non-native, that they've been planted.
None
that
of
was
them.
that was
Yeah.
that was striking.
Well, plus also, as we know, trees don't grow in straight lines.
Right. Well, well, even that landscape, you sort of had that just the bluff shot with the
shot,
the agave, and then the trees in the distance, and just to see those there, that they shouldn't be there. Yeah.
So so we again, this is a good example of this historic photograph. So this is a block, actually it's a cool block where they had like a little gardens that were right next to the houses, and then they had this sort of middle ground garden. And so in this family, this was largely a vegetable garden, although you got a few flowers like right here, but mostly she grew, and this is one of the ones that I talk about in the book because I have an oral history with her son right here, Mr. Hirano, and then she also wrote about her time in camp, although she didn't write about gardening. But so they mostly grew things like squash and cucumbers to be able to make sukemono, to make Japanese pickle. And we do find lots of crocks for pickling. So we think that there was a lot of pickling happening in camp.
In this photo next to it too, it says that this is the Amache Town Hall Garden.
The one up above.
Yeah, would you assume that this group of men would be some sort of like town hall kind of representative? I know there were kind of block leaders, that sort of were representatives for the various barracks, and you sort of had some loose organizational government structure. Is that correct?
Yeah, and actually a not so loose government organizational structure. So these are the block managers.
Yeah.
So basically, and this is, I think, common in a lot of the camps, is that, so each block is basically like a neighborhood.
Mhm.
So each block has their own barrack. They have their own sort of combination, latrine and laundry and shower facilities. And they've got a recreation hall. And it's about 250 people or so. And so each block gets to, they vote in one block representative. So that that's like their person on the town council. And then all of those authorities meet pretty regularly. And they, to be able to sort of, air complaints and help distribute information. And that they are basically the town council. And so this garden that you see in there is really this showpiece, essentially park that is next to Amache Town Hall. And it's this beautiful, and it's kind of hard to see because the gentlemen are all standing on it, but that's an artificial hill that's next to it. So it's a pretty classic hill and pond garden of the kind that you would see in a strolling garden, except, very much shrunk down. And this was one of the few gardens that we have specific memories of that garden, and that I did an oral history with a woman who her husband was the secretary for the block, for all of those that organization of the block managers. So he took all the minutes for their meetings, and she recalled that I don't know if you can see all this rounded cobble that's used in here along the edge of it, that was all river cobble from the Arkansas River. And because this was the official town hall, they were able to get a truck from camp, and they went down to the river and loaded up all of that rock and brought it back, a couple of truckloads worth. And they also went down the Arkansas River and caught either a catfish or a carp to take the place of a koi.
Yeah. Interesting. Is this photo in your book?
Yes, it's in my book. And then I also have a color, well, it's not a color in the book, but I do have another picture of it that I have a bunch of pictures of this garden because lots of people took pictures of it. It's kind of a showpiece.
Yeah, just to lastly, I'd love to see a higher resolution of this, just to maybe identify any, possible bonsai practitioners that might have known to have been in the camp and might have been block leaders. I would have, anyway.
Yeah, I certainly, I have a digitized version of it. I can share with you if anybody, would recognize. And there should be a list somewhere of who all were the block managers.
Oh, okay, yeah, great.
Awesome. Well, we do have a couple more questions I just want to get to, see if we can sneak them in. Want to be respectful of your time as well, Dr. Clark. So is your recipe for an Amache inspired garden derived from your research, or are the 3 points that you recommended reflected in the gardens that were created at Amache?
Yeah. So basically, time and time again in these gardens, I see they're reusing, they're using materials that are from this place. So whether, again, it's the rocks from the Arkansas River, or it's transplanted native plants. And then we're seeing then things that tie to Japanese heritage, whether that is, design techniques or again, there's these philosophy like seeing the value in overlooked things. Which is both Motenai, it's also a value in Buddhist thought as well. And then so those 3 things, again, we just keep seeing them over and over again. So, make beauty out of trash, use the local, and use your heritage. And so when I wanted to kind of, and this was partly because I was talking a lot about the book and I wanted to kind of try it out and see what it would look like in the whole. And it was also, again, part of my COVID coping strategy. I'd been wanting for a while to make an Amache inspired garden. So I took the time to do it. And I really was pleased with the result. It didn't, my Malvaceae didn't make it over the winter, so I need to replant. But we're really only just coming out of the snow here in Colorado, so I'm going to wait a while before I make this year's version of the garden.
Awesome. During your next trip in 2022, what are the goals of that project? And is there anything you're especially excited for?
Well, we are going to, one of the things that we're going to, that we are slated to do is that we're going to survey the block that was the high school. And I'm excited about that because it looks like there's some pretty extensive landscaping there, and we do have some photographs. So I'm going to kind of be interested to see about where these sort of like a kind of more official landscape and how that compares to these ones that are sort of on a block by block basis. A kind of landscape that may be a little bit like this town hall garden that probably everybody in the camp contributed to. So I'm excited about that. I'm always just excited to be out there with my great group of volunteers and high school students. And so just to be out there in the field and to see people kind of reconnect to this place is always, inspiring. And, I really hope that by the next time we're out there, it is actually, as they're trying to make these decisions about, how to transform it into a park. So that will also, to be there to kind of help to talk through, at least from my viewpoint as an archaeologist, what would be, some of the smart things in terms of management. So I'm hoping that I can be touring Park Service officials through the camp as we're doing our work.
Wonderful, thank you. And then final question, how did those trees grow so large in such a few number of years?
Well, I will say that they partly is all of those nutrients that those folks put in and then they started, most of them started out about like 6 feet, so they weren't very big trees. They also they chose wisely. Most of the trees are Chinese elm, which are, not a tree that anybody's like super duper in love with most of the time, but they are hardy, and they, once they take hold, they're hard to kill. And so, but I do talk about it in the book that, for example, in one block where the tree planting was coordinated by a family who had owned a nursery, is that they made sure that they got peat moss. And so when they transplanted them, they packed them in with peat moss to give them a good organics that would slowly break down in that environment and help feed the trees.
Wow. Okay, well, that is all our questions, and we're at 1:03. So thank you so much for staying a little bit longer, Dr. Clark, to answer questions. And thank you to everyone who attended. This was very informative. Lots of thank yous in the chat. And yeah, like I said, we'll be sending out this presentation to everyone who registered. It's available to members. And yeah, any parting words, Dr. Clark or Aaron?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks so much to Dr. Clark, and then also just, it's given me a whole new perspective on the objects we have borrowed and that are on display currently. So for anyone who's not aware, we have about 5 objects that Dr. Clark's excavated that are from Amache, one of them being a tin can that's been pierced. I think that piece of quartz, or one that looked very similar to it.
I think you do have that beautiful piece of quartz.
Yeah, that piece of quartz we saw in the presentation is here, representing those imported stones, so to speak, as well as some hand-fashioned wire and decorative fencing from one of those entry gardens. So come on back to the museum to give those a second look if you haven't already.
And thank you so much for being here today and listening, and enjoy your spring.
Thank you. Yeah, we hope you get one soon. And
yeah, us too.
All right. Thank you, everyone. We're going to sign off now. Have a great rest of your day.
All right. Bye-bye.